Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Digital Marketing Therapy Podcast. I love podcasting and I started doing it earlier this year. It was something that was new for me, but something I've been wanting to do for a while. And I've had a blast coming to you guys every week. I hope you've been enjoying the episodes. And I know several of you are interested in starting your own podcast or are just curious about what it takes. And so I have an expert guest with me here today, Krystal Proffitt, and she is going to be sharing with you ideas for how to start a podcast, what you need to get into it, and how she's grown her podcast. Krystal Proffitt is a podcast host, online educator, and is obsessed with all things podcasting. Between her weekly episodes on the Proffit podcast videos on her YouTube channel, and constant interaction with clients and students, she spends most of her time helping entrepreneurs start, launch, and market their podcast. So who better to share with you all of the things when it comes to creating a podcast than Krystal? So I'm really excited to have this conversation to hopefully inspire you to start a podcast. It's been super fun for me. I have a podcast with my daughter called Conversations with My Daughter. She's 10. And I also have a podcast with clients that we run. So I'm definitely deep into it, but I can always learn some stuff. And I learned a few things from Krystal, and I know you will too. But before we get into it, this episode is brought to you by our 30-day website roadmap. It's the last quarter of the year. It's the last quarter of the decade, you guys. No pressure. But what that means is it's a perfect time to really evaluate your website and see if it has all the elements it needs to be successful going into 2020. Is it reaching your customers? Is it speaking their language? Is it set up to execute the goals that you have lined out for your business? Our 30-day roadmap walks you through all of the things that you should consider before designing, redesigning, or just auditing your website, which I definitely recommend you do at the end of every year. So you can download that freebie at thefirstclick.net/30 days. I hope you'll check it out. It's a great resource and will help your business grow in 2020. So let's get to the episode. You're listening to the Digital Marketing Therapy Podcast. I'm your host, Sammy Bedell-Mulhern, and each week I bring you tips from myself and other experts, as well as hot seats with small business owners and entrepreneurs to demystify digital marketing and get you on your way to generating more leads and growing your business. I want to give a big warm welcome to Krystal. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the podcast.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. This is going to be fun.
It's going to be fun. And we're talking all things podcasting today. So I already read your intro. They kind of know a little bit about you, but I would just love to hear kind of what you love about podcasting and why this is your platform of choice.
Oh my gosh. I feel like the biggest loser at times because I love it so much. And I create so much content around podcasting. And I've had people ask me like, well, there's so many things, like so many aspects of the online world. And while I love so many of them, like I just cannot shut up about podcasting. So the reason why I love it so much is because I've tried lots of other things. I originally started blogging. I had a corporate job for several years, and then I started staying at home after I had my second son. And I was like watching all these other mommy bloggers having a lot of success. And I thought, oh, well, I can start blogging. Well, if you have created any content as a blogger and you haven't had success, then you're not alone. I did it for a few years. I had no idea what I was doing. I was so frustrated and I got really burned out doing it. But in the process, there was a blogger that I followed and she started a podcast. And before I saw her create a podcast, I had thought it was kind of reserved for people that had these $1 million companies, because that's kind of what I listened to. I got into podcasting listening to Dave Ramsey and Christy Wright and other people that had really large organizations or they were part of a large organization. So I didn't really think about everyday people having a podcast. And then she did it, this blogger that I followed. And I thought, well, I can do that. I love to talk anyway. Talking comes more natural to me than writing. Like when I sit down to write something, it is literally like trying to like it's nails on a chalkboard for me. Like even still to this day. And I write a lot of stuff, like so much content throughout the week. But my little secret, like hack for that is y'all, Okay, everybody listen up. If you are a content creator of any kind, you go into Google Docs.
Yes.
You go to tools and you click voice typing and you speak into your microphone. You speak into the computer, and that is how I write everything. So anyway, but that's how I got into it. Like just speaking, being able to turn on a microphone and start talking is just so, it flows. Everything flows. Like there's no roadblocks. I don't try to edit myself. I can just show up, turn on the microphone, and be myself. And so that is what I love about it.
Well, there's so many good things that you just touched on in just that brief little introduction. The fact of like, yes, if you're going to have a business online, you do need to be creating content on a regular basis. So create content in the way that you get energized by. If you hate writing, don't have a blog.
Right.
I mean, it's really that simple. If you hate video, don't do video. Although, I mean, I have a whole different thing about that. But if you like to talk, I'm the same way. Like a podcast is just so natural and easy. I agree with you 100%. And podcasting is much less saturated than YouTube or kind of the blog sphere right now, don't you think?
Yes. And it's funny because when someone asked me about, well, what do you think about the landscape of podcasting? And I'm like, well, I see it. It's still kind of the Wild West. Like, people, there's not a lot of, I guess, guidelines in place. Like there's a lot of people still making it up as we go, as far as, how do you handle interviews and how do you reach out to guests and how do you do all these other things? Whereas I feel like podcasting is what blogging was probably 10 years ago, when people were really like, it's starting to really ramp up. People are starting to see a lot more traffic, a lot more downloads. Like you see these people that explode as soon as they have a podcast. But really the trick behind that is just having something that people want to listen to and that they want to hear about and that is relatable to them. So it is not too late to start a podcast for sure.
Well, and do you feel that the beauty behind the podcast is you can be a little bit less vulnerable in that you're not on camera and you don't have your image, you don't have to worry about how you look or the backdrop and all of that and the polishing of that. But it's more personal and interactive than a blog in that people do get to hear your personality. They get to hear your voice. So it's kind of the best of both worlds if you're trying to get out there a little bit more.
Absolutely. I mean, I love video is something that I have learned to adopt more myself. I've kind of challenged myself to do more Facebook Lives and do YouTube and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, y'all, there's so much preparation that goes into live video or video period. But with a podcast, like I can throw together an outline for something that I want to talk about, which, for me, I'm 86 episodes in. So, I mean, I've been doing podcasting for a while, but I can just have my outline and just go because it just flows naturally for me. So my suggestion is if you feel comfortable talking, and I'm not talking about public speaking. That's a totally different monster, because there's all kinds of anxieties and everything. Like even if you've been doing it for a long time, public speaking can still be a challenge. But with podcasting, if you are just comfortable being yourself and talking to someone, like I imagine that I'm talking to a friend that's asking me a question whenever I'm podcasting. And it just feels comfortable. It feels a little awkward at first. I'm sure, Sammy, you've had this exact same experience where you're like, okay, I'm in a room by myself talking to like, I feel a little awkward. But once you get over that, like, it's just so empowering to be able to record episodes whenever you want. Like right now, it's bad weather outside. Like it's dark in here. So if I wanted to shoot a photo shoot or, do a video shoot or whatever, like it would be challenging, but you don't have to see me. I can record a podcast. I've done podcasts on my phone. You can do them literally anywhere. And I think that that's what's so empowering about the platform.
Yeah. I mean, this episode will be episode 28, I believe, when it goes live. And so every other episode that I do is me by myself. And then every other one is an interview. And I definitely like the interviews way better. It feels more natural. It's much easier because like you said, I'm not just sitting in a room talking to nobody. And they've gotten better. I'm getting better. But it's a lot to have to bring somebody on every time. So that's the format I've created. But I think it's just so like everything you're saying, I agree with. It's so amazing just to be able to share knowledge, throw it out there, and hope that you're impacting people in a way that helps them, regardless of if they come through and become a customer, client, student, whatever of yours. So I want to touch on technology, because I think that is the biggest hang up for people is I don't have a professional mic. I don't have somebody to edit. I have no idea about hosting. And they're just like, okay, done, shut down. I'm moving on. So what is your advice for people that are wanting to get started?
Oh my gosh. So you just touched on every single emotion, every single feeling that everyone has, including myself, whenever I got started. There's a lot of information online. And so you start seeing people that are like, oh, you have to set it up this way. Well, then you find out, 20 minutes into the YouTube video that that's going to cost me $5,000 to set up. Okay, next, let's go to somewhere else. And I don't know about you. I don't know about everybody in the audience, but y'all, I'm the cheapest person alive. Okay. I am on a budget. I have 3 kids and, I don't have thousands of dollars to throw at podcast equipment. So I got started for $30. That is literally all it took for me to start my podcast. I bought you need a USB microphone and a laptop with a desktop, like a computer with an internet connection. And I bought a pop filter. That is the only additional thing that you actually don't even need. So you could get started with a podcast for $20 and it's good enough. I think that a lot of people have this idea because people like Dave Ramsey and a lot of other really big name podcasters, you see them they've been in the industry for years. They were in radio, then they came over. Well, they brought all of their fancy studio equipment to the podcasting world. So there's almost this idea that you have to invest. And I'm telling everyone, please listen to me. You do not have to have fancy equipment. Your message and your content is 1,000 times more important than even the quality of your sound. I have listened to podcasts that are amazing. They get millions of downloads every year and their audio, it sucked. It was terrible. They even said that during an interview, I'm sorry, the audio's bad, but we went ahead with this content because it was so good. And she was right. I loved every second of the interview that she did. And it was kind of spotty, it kind of cut in and out. And I got frustrated a little bit, but I kept listening because that is how important the content was to me. Sorry, I just kind of got on my soapbox, but I
think that's good.
Frustrating. You can do it.
You can do it. And right now, I don't know if you have a mic plugged in front of you, but I know I'm literally have my headphones plugged into my laptop. I have a Blue Yeti mic.
Right.
I think was $140.
Mm-hmm.
But we do multiple podcasts for clients. And so it was an expense that was worth it. But I often don't even plug it in because I'm too lazy. Yeah. And right now, for example, there's crazy construction happening outside my door. And so it will literally pick up everything, which is good, but bad. And so I'm using earbuds plugged into my computer and we're recording through Zoom.
Right.
So it's not crazy.
I was going to say, I have a Blue Yeti as well. I have mine plugged in just because I have it right here, the way my setup always is. But y'all, okay, this is behind the scenes exclusive, not really an exclusive because I tell everybody this because I record in my closet. Okay. I have tried a million different ways. I have a cute office. We've moved so many times since my husband and I have been married. And this is the first house that we've ever lived in where we actually have an office. But this office, and I'm sure you can hear it right now, it echoes like nobody's business. I have put acoustic panels on the wall. I have tried so many different things, but it echoes so bad in here. So if you have that same problem, go record in your closet. Mm-hmm. It's what I do every week. And, until I can get this office figured out, it's what I'm going to continue to do. So be scrappy with what you have. I've heard of podcasters that will literally get under a blanket and record on their bed to get to muffle out all the extra noises. I think that's a little extreme. I would get claustrophobic under a blanket, but you can totally make it work. You can do it.
Yeah. And I think the message is, like you said earlier, it's more about the quality of the content and does it resonate with the people you're trying to reach out to? then they'll be more quote unquote forgiving in the beginning, but it's more just about getting started and doing it.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So what is the next kind of biggest hurdle that you kind of hear from people when it comes to taking the plunge to actually, okay, I've recorded the podcast. Now I'm actually going to put it out there to the world. Like, how do I do that? And I know that's a very complicated question. There's a lot more steps to that, but
it's really not, because it's funny you asked us, because this is what I hear all the time. It's like, okay, I got over my initial, like, a lot of my students, my clients, like they freak out just when they purchase their equipment. They start like jumping up and down and they're like, oh my gosh, like this is real. I have a microphone. I'm like, yes, but now we have to record. Like I remember doing the same thing. I was so excited when I got my microphone, because it's like a fun thing. Like, oh, I'm taking the next step. And then I'm not sure what equipment or what software you use. I use Audacity, which is a free software. If anyone's interested in podcasting, you can use Audacity, or if you're a Mac user, you can use GarageBand. Those are both free. But you get in there and you start playing, you're like, okay, I'm going to record. And then you're like, okay, I think it sounds good. But then you ask someone to listen to it and your stomach is totally in knots, because all you're thinking about is how you sound. This is the biggest hurdle that I see. It has nothing to do with the content. It's like that first time you hear yourself like on your voicemail, right? Like, I don't know about you, Sammy, but my mom, like, we had like the old school house phone, and you had a voice recorder, say, oh, you've reached the Blair household, please leave a message. And she would always say something and she would hear it. We'd walk in the house, like, oh my gosh, that's my voice. I can't stand to hear my own voice. And this is the same for everybody. Everybody has an issue with how they sound. And if you get into podcasting, I promise you'll get over it fast, because if you start editing your own stuff, you kind of hear it. It's like white noise. You just kind of hear the content, coming back at you. But yeah, that's the biggest hurdle that I see. It's not even about hitting publish per se, because like, oh, then we've started. It's more of, what are people going to think of my voice? Like, I'm too loud, or y'all, I'm from Texas. I'm from East Texas, which is, if you're not familiar with Texas, there are different dialects depending on where you live in the state. And my accent, people have told me it's not as bad. They can't hear it as bad, but oh my gosh, at one point in my life, it was so bad. And I was very self-conscious of how, redneck I sounded, or we're going to make fun of me or whatever. And so when I started podcasting, I was very conscious of that. Like, people are going to think, here's this backwoods chick that doesn't know what she's talking about. How is anyone going to take me seriously because of the way that I sound? But now, like I said, more than 80 episodes in, I realized it's all in my head. That's BS, y'all. Like, it's not about how you sound. It is about, do you sound confident in your message? That's so much more important. Do you actually know what you're talking about? That's so much more important than how you sound. So,
well, and you're going to have to get over it, because I'm lucky I don't have to edit my own podcast, because my business partner is my brother. And so he does all of that part, but I do all the show notes. And so I do have to listen to every episode in full. And so at that point, you're like over it,
right.
Whatever. But what's really good about it, I think, when you're listening to your own, is you start to hear the things that you say over and over and over again, the, terms you say, and I try not to say them now, or it's gotten me better now in all of my podcasts, because you don't understand the things that you're repeating all the time, right. The likes, the so's, and they still come out, the ums, the ahs, but it just is going to help you do better to push through that and listen to yourself. And then my daughter and I have a podcast together. And so that's just hilarious, because I'm like, and she's the same way. She's 10.
That's so fun.
And
that's
she
so fun. I love
cringes at the sound of her own voice. And so everything you're saying, yes, that's true. But get over it.
Well, and I want to like say a quick note on what you just said about like the editing and the ums and the ahs and the really, or like big pauses because you messed up. Okay. If you are listening to this and you're considering starting a podcast, don't edit the thing to make it sound like perfectly polished, because you're going to end up sounding robotic. Yeah. I am in so many podcast groups where someone will say, okay, I have a 30-minute episode and it took me 4 hours to edit this thing. How can I make it shorter? And I'm like, oh my gosh, well, what are you editing out? Like, I mean, I mess up all the time. Like every single, like I never sit there and record an entire episode all the way through without, losing my train of thought or messing up like once or twice. But y'all, I don't do that much editing. If I have a 30-minute episode, I go through, I listen to it, and maybe I'll cut out the pieces. But if it's me breathing, we're all human, guys. Like we're all human. And unless it's like a ridiculous, like a weird sound, I don't edit those out because I'm trying to pretend like we're having an actual conversation, like a human talking to another human. And I don't agree with all of the super hardcore editing because it's going to make you burn out. It really is. Yeah. It's going to make you frustrated with the process, and it just makes it so much harder. So if you're thinking about doing it and you are going to be editing yourself, just go easy on yourself, especially in the beginning. Give yourself some grace. You're going to mess up. I'm sure, Sammy.
I've got a story for you.
Yeah.
And you guys are all going to go back and listen and never be able to listen to my first few episodes again. But I was super sick and we had a deadline. But I was super sick when I was recording my first 2 or 3 episodes, and like sore throat bad. And so my voice sounded okay, but you can literally hear me swallowing in the episodes.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't know what to like. It just is what it is. I don't know what to tell you. I'm sorry. Like we're just going to move forward because we have to keep going. But now if you go back and listen to the first couple of episodes, you're going to be like, oh my God, like I can totally hear you swallowing in the microphone.
Hear it.
I was so sick.
But I love that you share that because, I believe, especially like with the lady who I listened to her podcast and she said, okay, there's some mess ups. Like, if you do have something like that and you just acknowledge it, like your audience is forgiving. They're not going to say, oh my gosh, Sammy breathed way too hard in this one episode. I'm never listening again. Right. Because I know if you are like me, I probably have like 30 podcasts that I listen to, not at all the time, but kind of on rotation. Like, oh, they have a good episode. I want to check this one out, check that one out. But even if they mess up, I'm not like, oh my gosh, no, never again. Never will I listen to this podcast. Like you have to mess up pretty bad for me to not listen to you anymore.
Well, and I think going back to the theme that is permeating through this episode is it's all about the content. Like you're going to stop listening to a podcast because the content they're providing is no longer of value to you, not because they have some scripts. So speaking of content, I feel like another thing you probably hear from people is I'm going to run out of things to say.
Yes. All the time.
Yeah.
All the time. And they're terrified of it. It's not just like, I might run out of things to say. It's like, okay, I have 10 ideas and then what? Like they start like even before they've launched, before they've actually sat down and really, really thought about the content. It's like they've quit before they've ever really decided to start and hit publish. So my suggestion, and I tell all of my students this, all of my clients is sit down and I want you to think about, let's say you are a yoga instructor and you wanted to create a podcast. What is every single facet of the yoga industry, right? You could talk about equipment. You could talk about different types of yoga. You could interview different instructors. You could talk, like the list goes on and on and on. And then write down ideas for every single one of those until you come up with 20. Because if you kind of flip the script on it like that and then think about all of the different pieces of the puzzle that are, under this one umbrella topic, like to me, I'm tell me if you have a question about your industry, please send me a message because I promise I could come up with at least 20 ideas for you on the spot. Because once you start looking for ideas, like what can I talk about? What can I do that'll add value to my audience? That is my number one rule is you have to add value to your audience in some shape, form, or fashion. Like it's the possibilities are endless. I mean, that's how I feel about it. So I just kind of see it everywhere. I don't know if everyone else sees it that way, but you won't run out of content. I promise you won't run out of it.
And we always ask why. So let's say if we go back to the yoga one and if it's like, okay, what yoga equipment do you need? Well, why do they care about what yoga equipment do they need? So maybe you could even break that into 5 different podcasts because it could be for what yoga equipment do you need if you're doing it at home? What yoga equipment do you need if you're going to a studio? What yoga equipment do you need if you're focusing on lower back issues? You know what I mean? Like, you can really break even all of those down into really minor things. Cause I think when it comes to content, we tend to take it from the level of what we understand.
Right.
You need to continue to break it down, keep asking why or how until you get down. Then you can really take one topic and turn it into 4, 5, 7 episodes.
And that's another great point too, is I think a lot of people try to shove like 7 ideas into one piece of content. You know, like I've seen people that create blog posts that are like 5,000 words long. And it's like, well, that's great, but you could have taken that and split it up into 7 different posts, you know, that you had 100%. For an entire week of content. So think about it that way, is instead of having, you know, 1 2-hour-long podcast episode, which please don't do 2-hour-long episodes. Those are just, it's too long. It's too much for me personally. That's just too much.
I agree.
There are some that can get away with it. It's too much, but you know, just think about what is one idea, one topic that I can talk about, and we don't talk about anything else. If we start branching off into a different area, then that's a new episode. That's a new idea. That's a brand new piece of content. So you won't run out. I promise you won't run out of ideas. If you think you will, message me. I promise I'll come up with like 20 ideas on the spot.
Well, I think it's true about this I mean, like you and I could probably have taken this podcast and broken it down into several. Like we could have talked about, you know, why should you start a podcast? And then how do you develop content for your podcast? And then how do you host your podcast? And then how, you know, like there's so many different things. I'm obviously not going to abuse you that much, but I think it's important to understand, like you said, one podcast, kind of one overarching idea. So then if we're talking about content, a lot of people do things differently. They do seasons, they do once a week, they do whatever. What is your thoughts on how often a podcast should be published? And the difference between having like regular episodes versus seasons?
So for me personally, I started, and this is where I suggest everyone start, at least 1 episode a week. 1 episode a week to get started. I don't suggest doing seasons unless your industry is seasonal, right? So let's say it's football, right? We're in the middle of football season and that's what everyone's going to talk about forever. But come springtime, no one cares about football anymore. Like they're into baseball or the, you know, whatever other sport that they're into. So unless your industry is seasonal like that, I suggest 52 weeks a year, you have 1 podcast episode. And I know if you think about it in a year's time, that sounds a little daunting, but remember, we go back to if you can come up with 20 ideas from all of your topic. I mean, 20 ideas is almost half a year like of content. So it's not that much, but I suggest at least 1 episode. And I don't suggest launching until you can have at least 5 months planned ahead of time. And I don't mean 5 months created. That's a lot. I'm not asking you to create 5 months worth of content. I'm just saying have 20 ideas on paper, because essentially that is 5 months. If you do 1 per week for 20 ideas, then that's 5 months. So if you plan everything that way, then you're going to be consistent. You're not going to be like, oh crap, I have to put up a new episode. What am I going to talk about next week? Because then you start spinning your wheels and you're reactive and you're stressing out and then it's not fun anymore. Like I want you to have fun with it. I want you to deliver value to your audience. I want them to say, Sammy, that was the best podcast episode you have ever put out. Like what is next? And that is also where you're going to get more content ideas, is when you create something, your audience is going to tell you what they like. They're going to download it more, or they're going to not download it more. And you're going to know, oh, yeah, maybe I don't need to talk about that anymore. That wasn't a very good, subject to talk about. But to your other question, I do 2 podcast episodes a week now, but I've been doing this for over a year. I just started this past May. We're recording this in September. So I've only been doing this for a few months. And it's a lot of work. It is a lot of work to have more than 1 episode per week if you're doing this totally by yourself. So that's why I don't suggest. I had a student who started doing 1 episode every day, like 5 days a week.
Oh, geez.
and she burned out really quickly. Like she told me it was like this. She felt like she had so much information that she just needed to get it all out. And then she was like, oh my gosh, I'm freaking out because I don't know what to do. I was like, yeah, I'd be freaking out if I were you too. Why did you do this in the first place? And anyway, but then now she's back to, she just does one episode a week. And, I just, your own schedule and how much you can handle. I know podcasts that are successful that just put out one episode a month. I mean, it's totally doable, but it's going to take you a lot longer to grow if you only do it once a month or once every 2 weeks. So if you're just getting started, I think it's worth the amount of effort to plan ahead way before you launch. Like plan, and then launch when you know that you can be consistent, at least putting one episode out a week.
And I think that's true of all content, whatever it is that you choose to do. That's a great lesson to keep in mind. Is there any, like with social media and stuff, there's algorithms and whatnot. And so with podcasting, you're actually pushing your podcast out to several different platforms, like whether it's Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Stitcher or whatever. So are there any algorithm reasons why you would want to do it weekly?
So I noticed, and the only reason, this is another reason why I decided to go from one podcast a week to 2. I wanted to see a spike in numbers. I felt like my podcast wasn't growing as quickly as I wanted it to. And so I thought, okay, if I had a blog, if I had, a YouTube channel, if I had anything else, how could I get my numbers to grow faster? Well, it's 2 ways. You can either get in front of more people, or you can put out more content where your existing audience has more to digest. They, have more listen time and everything like that. So that's one of the reasons why I moved to having more episodes. But like I said, I do not suggest this to someone that is just starting. You definitely want to just do what works for your schedule. But I will say that if you are trying to, it depends on what your goals are. And I think that you should have a goal for your podcast before you ever get started, before you ever hit publish. You need to know, am I doing this to grow my influence? Am I doing this to impact my community? Do I want to be on the new and noteworthy? Like what is the reason that you're starting this podcast? Because that is going to determine your launch strategy, because there is a formula to getting on these, like the new and noteworthy. And that is, you need to have so many downloads, which I don't know, like they haven't pulled back the curtain and said you need to have X amount of downloads in the first week. But the first week of your podcast is very crucial to getting on these lists. So listens, subscribers, reviews, like all of these are things to consider if that is your ultimate goal. I didn't know any of this when I launched my podcast. So I'm not standing here saying like, oh, I can tell you exactly what to do because I was not on the new and noteworthy. Okay. I can tell you that right now. And I recently crossed over. My podcast is in the top 100 finally, after like busting my butt for the last year. But still, like, I feel like I have so much more to grow and to learn. And so just make sure, the last thing I'll say about like trying to rank your podcast, it's kind of like a losing battle if that's all you're going for. Mm-hmm. Because what if you hit number 1? Then what? Are you going to still contribute and consistently put out really good content? Like, what is your ultimate goal for getting that? Like, do you just want to be able to say, oh, I have a number 1 podcast. All right, I'm done. I'm going to wash my hands of this podcast. So just really think about that. Like, even if you do, if that's your goal, you hit it, then what? Yeah. But when it comes to, doing these charts and all these things, so iTunes, what was iTunes is now Apple Podcasts. Mm-hmm. Like Apple has split up all their platforms, and Apple Podcast, at least within my hosting site, which is Buzzsprout. If anyone wants to check out a hosting site, I suggest Buzzsprout. It's what I've used from the beginning. Yeah, we use Libsyn. Okay. See, and that's another amazing one that I've heard great things about Libsyn as well. I would be like word to the wise, like be a little cautious of the ones that claim that they're free. Just make sure you read all of the fine print before you go down that rabbit hole.
Well, and I'm going to pause you here for a second because a lot of you are probably being like, wait, we have to host our podcast somewhere.
Yes.
So I'll put some additional resources in the show notes here, but just as a brief overview, you host your podcast like you do your website, and then it will then disperse your new episodes out to all of the platforms with which they don't all do it the same way, but then it will disperse your podcast out to all of the places where you've gotten your podcast approved.
Right.
So a whole other topic for a whole other time, but before you're like hearing this and going, oh my goodness. Anyway.
Yes, you're like, my head is just about to explode. You're giving us way too much information. Yeah. You don't have to upload your podcast to Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, SoundCloud. Like you don't do that. You upload it to one place once a week or whenever you upload, and that's it. Like they take care of the rest.
Yes.
But going back to like, so for example, I'm just going to use Apple Podcasts because it's the most widely known and it's the one that most people look to when they look at podcast rankings. Mm-hmm. The number one thing that you want to make sure that you do when you set up your podcast is you pick the right category. Mm-hmm. And that is with my hosting site, I can pick up to 3. And my podcast, I teach about podcasting. I know it's kind of meta, like that's what I teach. But so I had to decide, well, do I want to be a business podcast? Do I want to be an entrepreneur podcast? Like I had to pick the right category that worked for me and where I would be successful being in front of the most people. So that's just something to consider. Like it's kind of food for thought. Like where would I show up best, or where would someone looking for this type of podcast, like where would they look for, education or business or finance or whatever it is that your topic is?
Mm-hmm. So I have one last question for you, and then we'll wrap this up because I know we've already talked about a lot of different topics. But obviously, whenever you're creating content, it's all about providing value and giving people information, but it's also about continuing to take them on the journey with you to eventually becoming a buyer of yours, a customer, client, student, whatever, right? Like we're not just doing this maybe you are, but for the most part, you're probably doing this as a lead magnet to your business. So how important is the call to action of some sort in every episode, and kind of what's your take on how that should kind of be presented?
Yeah. Okay. I'm so glad you asked this question because this is of all the podcasting topics, I love talking about promoting yourself within your podcast, right? Because a lot of people talk about, oh, I just can't wait to get a brand deal. I want someone to come pay me thousands of dollars to talk about them on my podcast. And I'm like, yeah, that's great. But unless you're getting millions of downloads, it's not going to happen for a while. So my suggestion to everyone is to have calls to action, even if they're really simple, in every single episode from day one. Even if it's just, hey, subscribe to the show, or leave us a review, or go join our Facebook group, or go follow us on Instagram. Get people used to hearing you ask them do something, because then when you get to the point where you're launching a product or a live event or you're doing something else, like you don't want that shock and awe, like, oh, I've been listening to Sammy for 6 months. She's never tried to sell me anything. And now she's trying to get me to come join this workshop that she's talking about, right? Like you don't want to have that okay, I have to share a quick story real fast, just because it still gets under my skin and I just get so red hot fired up about this. I listened to a podcast forever and they kept saying, it was like in every episode, we'll never have ads. We'll never have ads. We'll never have ads. We'll never have ads in this podcast. What happened? They started having ads. Not only ads, they were bad. Like they weren't even relevant to the content that was in the show. So I quit listening. This was several years ago. So I never want that to happen to anybody that has a podcast. Start asking people, your listeners, to do something every single time, even if you have no aspiration to have a business or, make money with your podcast. Ask them to go make a donation to the Salvation Army. I don't care what it is, but ask them to do something. Check out your show notes in every single episode, because when they get used to that ask, and what if an opportunity for you to be an affiliate for another product or another service, if that comes up and you insert that as an ad into your podcast, it's not that much of a surprise. Like people aren't like freaking out about it. And you don't have that. I felt betrayed by that podcast. Like, I know that's a bit like, it's dramatic. I understand that, but it's how I felt. Like, I thought I'm never listening to these people again because they said forever they would never have ads.
Well, you're building a relationship with the people that you listen
Yes.
to in your ears all the time. And, you know, even though it's not a personal, real, like face-to-face relationship, if they're telling you something and they go back on their word, then how are you going to trust them in anything else? And it's not, here's the thing, we're in business to make money.
Right.
And it doesn't mean we're not trying to make an impact along the way and help people, but you are doing this and you're giving them all of this amazing information.
Yes.
So as long as your content is good, you've delivered something, you've given them value. So for you to say something like, hey, sign up for my challenge or like sign whatever, you're not going to say on your podcast, hey, sign up for my $12,000 course that I'm launching. Like, you know, it's all within reason, but don't feel, I like what you're saying. Don't feel bad about making those asks big or small. I mean, we have no desire to monetize. I keep talking about my podcast with my daughter just because it's like, it's just a fun thing we do.
Right.
So we aren't trying to monetize it or anything right now, but we still ask in every episode for people to follow us on Instagram.
Yeah. Yeah. And it, like I said, it doesn't have to be this like earth moving type of thing, like a huge ask, like you said, a $12,000, you know, scholarship or, you know, membership program or whatever. Like, subscribe to the show. If you enjoyed this, that way you get a notification. And then it would be cool if you leave us or left us, or I can't even talk now, left us a review, you know, but just social media, you know, sign up for our email newsletter, whatever it is, but just get them used to hearing it. That way, if the opportunity does come for you to promote your product or an affiliate, then it doesn't feel awkward for you or for them. Mm-hmm. It's like, oh, Sammy has this new cool thing that like, I want to go check that out because she's given me so much value in all of these other episodes. I bet that this will be really good for me. I know that that's how I feel whenever someone offers something in their podcast and it feels genuine. I mean, that's like, number one is add value. Number two is like, or that's like kind of all number one, like just be genuine and add value.
Yeah. So, do you have any like last words of advice or, you know, thoughts that you would want to share with our listeners about why they should start a podcast or how podcasting has been such a positive impact on you and your business?
You know, it's just, I mean, obviously it's so much fun. Like that's like for me,
I love that.
It's so much fun. And I've had people ask me like, don't you get tired of it? Aren't you burned out? Like, aren't you like we've talked about, people are like, don't you worry about not having something to say? And I just feel like, y'all, I'm just getting started. That's really, like I said, I'm already 80 plus episodes in, and I do feel like I'm just getting started. I've really hit my stride. I know what my audience wants to hear. So if you're thinking about doing it, or if you've already started and you feel like it's kind of rough, that's normal. Like, it's just like anything else. Like, imagine like you're a baby who's learning to walk, like you're going to stumble, you're going to fall down, you're going to have some bad interviews, you're going to have some bad episodes that fall completely flat that no one listens to, but you learn from those things. So just keep going. And I say this in all of my podcast episodes is keep it up. We all have to start somewhere.
Yes.
Because it's true. Like Sammy and I both started from 0 episodes, and you just got to keep going.
Mm-hmm. I love it. And that's so good. And I think that's a good lesson just in general with business owners. Like, you just have to put one foot in front of the other, keep trying things and see what works.
Yes.
So if people want to know more about you, and of course we'll have all of these linked up in the show notes as well, but if people want to know more about you and kind of how you can help them get started with podcasting, how do they find out more about you?
Well, I would invite anyone that's listening, you know, if you've even kind of thought maybe a podcast would be for you, I have a podcast boot camp that is 100% free. You don't have to pay, you don't have to do anything, but you just go to krystalproffitt.com/podcast bootcamp. And I literally go through, it's a 5-day video series that shows you all of the basics, where I talk about my $20 microphone. Like, I show you which one it is. And then I tell you about equipment and some software basics and interviews and solo episodes. So it's just a great place to get started.
That's awesome. Yeah, we'll link that all up for you. And thank you so much. This was awesome. I learned some good stuff myself.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. This was great. And I hope that everyone found a lot of value in everything we talked about today.
Oh, for sure. I'm sure they will. There was a lot of good stuff in here. So thank you. And maybe we'll have to have you on a future episode to do like podcasting 102.
Oh, I'm all about it. I'm all about it. Yes.
Okay. Thanks. I just want to give another huge thank you to Krystal for taking out some time to chat with us about podcasting. As you can tell, we're both super excited about it, and we had a lot of fun talking about this topic. So I hope you got some great takeaways, and I'd love to hear all about them. You can leave a comment on this episode at thefirstclick.net/28. I would love to hear your takeaways there. Otherwise, make sure you subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss an episode. And if there's something you'd love to hear us talk about, please let me know. We want to make this impactful and helpful for you. So if there's a topic we haven't talked about yet or something you'd like us just to dive a little bit deeper into, we're here for you. So hit us up on social media at The First Click Marketing or find us at thefirstclick.net. We'll see you next week.